Panel 2 focused on social issues and education and featured presentations by Dr. Lissa Paul, professor in the Faculty of Education at Brock University, and Dr. Talia Esnard, lecturer in the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of the West Indies. The panel was moderated by Dr. Michael Owen, Dean and Professor in the Faculty of Education at Brock University.
My name is Michael Owen, and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Education at Brock University. It's my pleasure to be back at UWI, although first time at the regional headquarters and the Mona campus. One of the things that as Dean of Faculty of Education that I'm particularly concerned about and focus on is the quality of teacher education and the quality of the learning that goes on in schools. We are very much interested in ensuring that our teacher candidates are fully cognizant of the social forces that shape our curriculum and that impact on how children and youth learn in schools and how children and youth access schooling. And particularly, we are also interested in why it is or how it is that they understand somewhat the hidden curriculum that is often embedded in the curriculum that we teach. We also feel that teachers too must be understanding of all the social, the historical, the political, and the economic processes that influence why some children go to school and succeed and other children go to school and don't succeed. And today our speakers will address some of these social issues in our session on social issues in education, one from a historical perspective, and the second from a more contemporary perspective. They will help us understand some of the the elements that shape the contours of learning and teaching across our two regions. Our first speaker will be Dr. Lissa Paul, who's a full professor in the Faculty of Education at Brock University. Dr. Paul is a literary scholar specializing in children's literature, particularly in children's poetry, as well as cultural studies, and more recently in 18th century and Caribbean literary studies. She has authored or edited, I think, more than 7 books, has chapters in another 19 books, and publishes widely in international journals. She also edits the Lion and the Unicorn for many years, and her research has been supported by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And I would go on and on and on, since Lissa's one of our great faculty members in our faculty, but we don't have enough time for that, Lissa. Our second speaker is Dr. Talia Esnard, who is currently a lecturer at the University of the West Indies St. Augustine campus, and she is within the sociology unit at the St. Augustine campus in Trinidad and Tobago. Her work centers on women in higher education and within the entrepreneurship space, and her current projects include female entrepreneurship in the Caribbean, comparative analysis of women in higher education, and today you will hear her talk about intra-household dynamics, seasonal migration, and social mobility. So let me, first of all, welcome our speakers and ask Dr. Paul to start us off.
Although I've called this, as you can see, the broader project is about Canadian and Caribbean, but I'm just going to focus on Barbados today. I'll start with a backstory in order to get to the story I'm going to do. And you should know that very rarely in the course of the dead quiet reading of archival material do living voices intrude in ways that are so compelling and so insistent that they demand a creation of the story of their own. Let me tell you, if you're an archival researcher, you might as well be part of the furniture. But what happened about 6 years ago, and it was a typically sunshiny, cerulean blue sky Saturday morning in Barbados. I was sitting in the very gloomy second floor corner of the National Library in Bridgetown, attempting to read microfilm copies of the Barbados Mercury Gazette from the period of around Buss's Rebellion, 1815 and 1816. I was there because it was early in research I was doing on another transnational woman, a British woman named Eliza Fenwick, and she's the subject of my recent book, who was a radical abolitionist British author and teacher. She was I do 3 degrees of separation from Frankenstein. She was a friend of Mary Wollstonecraft's and Godwin. She was there when Mary Shelley was born. But in terms of transnational linkages, she was in Barbados in 1816 around the time of Buss's Rebellion, and she'd been an abolitionist in England. And then she ended up in our neighborhood, 20-minute drive from where I teach at Brock and in Toronto. And of course, in Niagara, it's important to know that 1793 was when the first legislation to limit slavery in the British Empire occurred, so again, in our neighborhood. And then she was in Niagara and Toronto in 1833, 1834 when slavery was abolished. But it was Alessandra Cummings, who's the brilliant curator of the Barbados Historical Society, that I suggested the microfilm copies of the paper in the library, and because they were otherwise locked in the archives. Now, even on the first encounter, and I'm going to do this backstory. So before I get to the bit I'm getting to, I need to do the backstory. So you have to know that the microfilms were incredibly difficult to use. They were in negative polarity, white on black. They were disintegrating. They were fragile. The only microfilm reader in the library was so clumsy. It was about the size of a big desk or drawing table, no copying function. In other words, it was one of those times when I was not part of the furniture. I was clearly taking up a lot of space. And because of the degree of concentration required to make any sense at all of the microfilm, I was very deeply focused and concentrating. And what I was doing, I was reading the Gazette issue by issue around the time of Buss's Rebellion and becoming increasingly distressed physically by the hell on earth it must have been for the enslaved in Barbados. And because it's so different than reading any kind of historical account when you're doing a day-by-day reading through, it was twice a week, account in the newspaper. I was absorbed, and I was also disgusted by the pages of rhetoric by outraged colonial politicians objecting to Wilberforce's proposed Slave Registry Act, claiming, and this is the financial part, they claimed it was taxation without representation, so they were riffing on the Americans. While aware, even in my earliest readings, that the people in column after column of fugitive slave ads were the living faces of resistance. And suddenly I was startled by 2 little boys they were both about 10, and they came up to me, and they were brightly curious, asking what I was doing, and I was too embarrassed to tell them, like I couldn't answer them. And so I did the thing that those of us who are at the front know to do. I turned the question and asked them what they were doing, and their faces fell, and they told me that they were doing research on slavery. "Did you know," said one boy, "that overseers used to prod slaves in their ribs with metal cattle prods?" And he demonstrated poking his finger in his ribs. And, I did know, and I knew more, but I wasn't going to say anything. But I had one of those kind of really magical teaching moments when somehow I found myself telling them about the sugar boycott of the early 1790s, when British children gave up sugar in solidarity with the attempts to shut down the slave trade after the defeat of Wilberforce's first bill in 1791. Now, the boys hadn't known about the boycott, but their faces immediately broke into smiles because they could tell their classmates about something that wasn't about victimization, pity, or suffering. It was typically about women and children trying to use an economic argument to counter the economic argument that was used by people who wanted to keep slavery, saying that they couldn't afford it because the economy would be destroyed. They were so pleased, and I could see that they were pleased by having this other story. Now, in sociological terms, they were responding to the agency of other children who were able to operate independently of the determining social structure. They were, as Colin Haywood explains in A History of Childhood, active in determining their own lives and the lives around them. Now, I'd not explained to the children that I was speaking to in the library, and you can tell these children have stayed with me. They are the reason that I'm doing this. That I didn't explain that the boycott failed initially, or that the white children were just giving up a luxury item, and that they were white British children giving up a luxury item. Yet it was the memory of those children, who now must be in their early teens, that has really driven my desire to figure out a way to give to the children of Barbados heroes of their own, children who resisted enslavement. Now, although my biography of Eliza is now in print, it was that first encounter in the library that launched what has been an ongoing project to memorialize the people of the Barbados Mercury Gazette. I could not get them out of my mind. And I took to calling them unofficially the people of Bus's Army. And in those ads were people who networked against the impossible odds in order. They were people who were really working against the odds. Unlike Jamaica, as you know, there are no mountains in Barbados. There's nowhere to go. And I was also haunted by the fact that if those microfilms disintegrated, it was made on diazo, which I now know is a non-preservation medium, that these people would die. So it was really with the help of Sir Hilary, Pedro Walsh, Alessandra Cummins, Evelyn O'Callaghan, and others at UWI in Cave Hill, that I was able to push for the British Library Endangered Archives Program grant. And in the end, I was a co-applicant on that grant, and the materials are now digitally available on the Digital Library of the Caribbean site and the British Library site. And I'm now also able to access them from my own computer. And that's when I started looking more closely at the people I'd only glimpsed in my earlier research. Although there's still no OCR capacity on the sites, even issue-by-issue reading turns up the identities of enslaved people and their resistance strategies. Because I'm interested in children speaking to children, I've also been aware that I'm working in the context of the child activist, Greta Thunberg. That's why this seems to be such an appropriate time, because she's got exactly the same thing that was used. She's trying to fight the economic argument that we can't do anything about climate change because we can't afford it. And that was exactly the argument that was used to take so long to get rid of slavery. So she's arguing to politicians in exactly the same way. Now, what struck me as I searched the pages of the Gazette from around the period of Bus's rebellion, that it was possible to find the children resisting. And although I appreciate that the evidence can only be glimpsed, it's compelling. I love this. Here's a child, and you can see the subscriber has taken up a black-skinned Negro girl by name of Mary Jane, who says she is free. She's just 4.5 feet high. You know, isn't this wonderful? This is a child who just declared that she was free. And I love that kind of example of resistance. And here's another one. This is, you can tell that this is a child because it was only worth $1 at the time. The runaway from a subscriber, a Negro boy named Tim. $1 reward will be given to apprehend him, and a further reward of £5 to any person that will give such information to prove his being harbored with any free or colored or white person. Then the next one is my favorite one because it speaks deliberately and particularly to Bus's rebellion. Absented from my service on the 4th without any cause. So that means that, well, supposedly he wasn't being beaten. A stout, dark mulatto boy named Tommy, about 4 feet 5 to 6 inches high, has rather thick and clumsy legs. He was seen to follow a detachment from St. Anne's to Bailey's in St. Philip. It's very probable that he may pass himself as being impressed for the service, having made the same excuse a few days after the insurrection, but was brought back. A reward for 1 Joe, that was a form of currency, will be given for his apprehension and delivery. Now, isn't that extraordinary? So you have a child who decided that he was going to be pretending he was part of the other. So he figured out how to engineer his own work. And as you can see, I'm trying to build up these stories of children who can be used for other children in Barbados and elsewhere to demonstrate the agency of other children. And there are 1,000 stories. And these children in my reading and in my reading of those ads were more alive. I mean, they've been dead for 200 years. They are incredibly alive and visible in a way that, you know, Sir Hilary's work on Bussa was very important to set up the pieces about leadership. But these are all of those other people. And memorializing them has become increasingly important. And there are ads everywhere. And you can see there are just more details about who these people were. And there's just one more slide. This is an example I wanted to say that despite families being separated, here are stories of literally how families looked after each other. £5 reward will be given to anyone who approach and lodge in a cage or deliver to the overseer a mulatto girl named Eliza Rose, 12 to 14 years old, suspected to have been taken to St. Vincent by her father, a free man of color named Jack Henry, a tailor by trade, or to be harbored by her grandmother, Mary Bella Padmore of this island, or by some of her relations or friends. And again, so it's just such a brilliant example of the kind of family care that was there and the kind of resistance that was available. As you can see, I wanted to give you this kind of quick glimpse that I was just able to do during my own work. And what I've tried to do, and so far without success, is really to interest children in Barbados schools or somewhere else to identify children like the ones I found, ideally children in their own parishes. And that would be, I think, a really wonderful way of celebrating them, of memorializing them. In things like, in Berlin, there are stumbling stones where you can have physical memorials to these people. It seems to me that it's possible to memorialize these people in their own physical spaces and time. So I'm good with anybody who's got any suggestions on how to expand that or to use this material, which is now publicly available, thanks to the British Library Endangered Archives Program, to Sir Hilary, all the people I know in Barbados, and to Dr. Kieran and everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paul, and particularly for the link between the historical records that you're looking at and also current day social, political, and educational issues. So I would like to now invite Dr. Esnard to talk about a story of intra-household dynamics, seasonal migration, and social mobility.
I am here with you today to share a story of Jessie Ann Miller, pseudonym applied in this case, and titled the paper, "Whenever the Girls Are Finished, That Is Cool, I'm going to write to the Canadian government a letter to say thanks. A story of intra-household dynamics, seasonal migration, and social mobility." So in October of 2015, and I just hope you bear with me with the reading because of the nature of the study, I visited Brock University under the auspices of the Canada CARICOM Leadership Program. And the intention initially was to look at diasporic entrepreneurialism, looking at women who have left the Caribbean and got involved in some sort of entrepreneurial activity in Ontario and otherwise and throughout Canada. And for some reason, after about 1 week of being in St. Catharines, I was somewhat stirred into the case of seasonal agricultural workers. And my initial reaction at the time was, this is quite interesting that something so profound with such implications does not feature farewell in the literature on migration. And I found that they remain pretty much a very invisible population, although it was earlier said that it's a traditional sort of partnership between Canada and the Caribbean. And it intrigued me why this group was particularly invisible and why the voices and the stories have not been told in a way that people understand what it is to be a seasonal agricultural worker and the challenges that were associated with that program. So I noted at the time that this is something that over the last couple of decades that they remain invisible, and a program that is so organized like this really remains fairly under-interrogated. So as an initial way of exploring this kind of research, I ventured into the use of a case study. And I was introduced to Jessie Ann Miller, as I earlier introduced, and got the privilege of having 2 very long interviews with this young lady. And in that interview, in speaking with her, I began to understand her experiences, her concerns of being in an initial state of vulnerability back in Jamaica and of becoming, several years later, a thriving citizen supported by her children who'd all completed school. In this particular case, her participation in what I would call the SAW program for now became a critical life changer. And although it was not without its struggles, she shares the story of her own experience. So please allow me to share some of the excerpts of the story. So Jessie Ann touched on the particular challenges of pushing ahead as a single parent with a high school certificate in Jamaica. She described herself as vulnerable without the ability to find a job that could sustain her 3 daughters. She says this: "It was just not happening for me in Jamaica. I tried working in the daycare centers, but that did not pay much. I could not help, the fact that my girls needed more from me. I needed to try something else. I tried something working in the supermarket, but that didn't pay much either. I constantly worried about the future of my 3 daughters. At the time, it just did not look good. I struggled as a single mother, and I tried everything I tell you, to get work and to do something that is worth something for my girls. But I knew very well that there was very little options in Jamaica, and I had to do something." So for Jessie Ann, the life changer came when she met someone who worked in the seasonal agriculture program in the US. And that person redirected her to a recruitment program in Jamaica at the time, and she quickly hurried to the ministry to find out whether she could participate in such a program, only to be told when she arrived that that program was closed, but there was one in Canada that is open and that she could apply. She was interviewed on that very same day, and 1 year later, actually moved to Canada to participate in this particular program. So she shared that particular story as well. So somebody was on the US program and told me about the experience. I went to the ministry and I found out, and I got the interview on that very same day. 1 year later, I arrived in Canada, but not before I worked out a plan with my children. We decided that my eldest daughter, who dropped out of school by 15 and was unemployed, would join me in the program 1 year later, and she did. But we also decided that my 2 youngest daughters would stay with the eldest sister, my eldest sister that is, who worked as a secondary school teacher in Jamaica. The plan was that we would sacrifice working on the farm to send money home, not for the girls to use for their own benefit, but to send them through to university. Once they both completed, the intention was to stop participating in the program. We agreed, and we continued. Throughout the interview, though, she stressed on the sacrifice and the collaboration of the household. She said without that understanding of what everyone needed to do to make this thing work, it just would not happen. And this is what she also said: "Everyone has their priority. My priority is to help those girls and help a generation to change. So my grandchildren would have a good future. My girls would not have to follow in my footsteps to worry about the next pay, the next job, the next dollar, or just where would they get money to care for themselves. That's what keeps me going. And I don't want to be idle and allow my girls to also fall through the cracks, like many young girls whose parents don't have the funds or the money to care for them. So that is really why I have to appreciate the Canadian government, because they have changed the future of my family, of my children and their children, and of Jamaica, even if they don't know it. And I tell myself whenever the girls are finished, I'm going to write to the Canadian government a letter to say thanks. Because it has helped me. I don't have a car in Jamaica, I don't have a house, but at the end of the day, my heart will be satisfied. I don't have to see my grandchildren, but I know that they will live a good life because their generation has changed. She also shared the story of the process and of her gratitude in the program. I am grateful because I know what would have happened if I stayed in Jamaica and if my children stayed in those conditions of poverty. I'm not doing this for myself. I came to Canada to care for my children. I came to Canada to change their lives. I came to Canada to make a difference when I go back home. My 2 girls are bigger right now. The first one is in her last semester of her law degree at the University of the West Indies. The second one, the little one she calls her, she is now starting her master's degree in gender studies at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica. Imagine, she actually finished her first degree with media and communication with honors. So I just sent her 1,800 Canadian dollars to help her with her master's program. In my mind, she says, my job is finished. The generation has changed, and so too have their lives. However, she said it would not be fair if I don't speak of the challenges of that program. She remained troubled by some of the challenges that she highlights below. She described this as a tough job that is divided based on gender. Of course, she did not use that word. It's a vegetable and fruit farm, she says. I pick branches of trees. I pick peas, cabbage, kale, zucchini. But what happens is that the men are responsible for the bigger fruit trees. And the women, well, sometimes we pick fruits, but most times we clean the floors and the windows. I don't mind because, as I said, I have to see about my children. But I know that if I did other things, that my income would increase. But of course, that's not a possibility. In delving into the conditions of her work, she talks about the dehumanizing and discriminating aspects of the job. She says this: we work very long hours, from 8 to 6, sometimes 7 to 6, it all depends. You work Sunday to Sunday, you don't get any day off. You don't get a time until 1 day or 2 before you go back home. This was not the same for other white women who worked on the farm. So you have no rights. You have a contract, the employer has a copy, you have a copy, but no one sees the contract through. I know the Jamaican government cares for us and somehow has standards around this particular contract, but I can't help but note that rules are not being followed. And if you talk about it, if you're complaining, you're at risk of losing your job. But I can't do that. I've got a family back home. Someone might criticize what I do, but if you understand my reality, then you will just shut up. But what I could tell you is that something around this particular job, something around this particular condition reminds me of slavery. You are treated like crap, and forgive the language, I'm trying to be as explicit as she was. You're pushed around, and it's so unfair. Nobody's whipping you on your back, but it's no difference. Tell me what's the difference when you can't speak, you can't walk, you can't go outside. You're forced to work long hours. You're not even given the freedom and the support to be you. You work in a program, you want to come out, but you can't. Through her story, I would like us to note the challenges associated, in this case, with being a seasonal worker, of leveraging placement to negotiate the complex web of gender, class, and racial divide across boundaries, although nuanced. I would like us to note the merits and demerits of her sacrifice, the intra-household dynamics that underpin this, and the successes of her 2 youngest daughters, as I mentioned, who've both completed the programs. The strategy here is one of intra-household consensus, where they use the enhanced economic and occupational opportunities in Canada to elevate the social and economic mobility of younger members of the household. The expectation in this case is for the younger ones, or the future educated members, who initially played the role of the receiver or the beneficiary, would later become the ones to take care of the older ones who initially made the sacrifice. This type of thinking and action is certainly consistent with members of the diasporic community who share concerns for the welfare of their children and who recognize the value of education as a means for social mobility. It is important to note in this case that there was little assimilation or acculturation, and in this particular instance, her intention was not to become a permanent resident in Canada, but to be part of a seasonal, temporary, formal program through which she could strengthen the socioeconomic standing and mobility of her household. We need for you, and she needs for you, to understand the whole issue of seasonal migration through the prism of difference. It is one of using and understanding her social and economic background and looking at the choices that she made because of that background and the experience of staying in what she described as very unfair circumstances and conditions to ensure that her children survive and become more than what she was at that point in time. I note, however, that despite the promotion of this SAW program and the advertisement in the various sort of publications about this as a best practice and a best model of social mobility for agricultural workers, and even the gains at the level of the state or the employer or the individual, that there's a lack of macro and micro analyses of the circumstances and experiences of these women. It is important for us to see issues of liberalism, individualism, collectivism, structure, and agency to promote the issue of well-being, positionality, and mobility of these recipients. Who cares about them, one may ask. I ask myself that very same question listening to this story. The case is even more worrisome because the literature on this is also very sparse. And that is interesting. It's traditional, but how traditional can traditional be when research on this remains absent? In this particular instant, we see concerns that also are echoed in other published bodies of work. I note, for example, the work of Francis Henry and Dwayne Plaza, for example, who speak of the alienation and isolation of agricultural workers in Canada. There's more extensive studies, other than that which I just did, of workers from Dominica, Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, and Tobago. For example, work by Beckford, 2016, with 89 agricultural workers. And in all of the literature, what is clear is that those people are vulnerable. They are mostly unemployed and underemployed with little schooling, dependent children, and need a livelihood to sustain themselves and to really secure the social standing of their family. Yet the question of the socioeconomic context and the application of such analysis to the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program, is less than forthcoming. The questions that emerge are therefore those of, what types of support systems are there in the region for single mothers? How effective are these in terms of circumnavigating the economic challenges for these women? What are the legislative and regulatory frameworks that guide such programs? And how are they monitored and evaluated? And how can this Canada-Caribbean partnership strengthen the relationship, but also empower the families that participate in this particular program? More is needed, but there's so much that is lacking. What is particularly interesting and worrisome is the lack of support from the diasporic community or even from unionized groups. What is even more concerning is that even with existing research around the cultural barriers and limited access to healthcare, fear of prosecution or reprisal, again, there is little action or advocacy for women who are in this program. I also share a related concern of the powerlessness of these seasonal workers. McLaughlin, for example, contended that the SAW program systematically recruits what he called ideal workers who come with strong work ethics and high level of compliance. Smith, for example, notes that while they are conscious of the reality of the seasonal work program, that the consciousness is ineffective and inadequate to translate or to adjust the realities that they are part of. And in this particular case, other researchers echo concerns for the precarious nature of work for those workers. There's a lack of support for pushing collective bargaining and for employment legislation that protect the rights of these individuals. I note too that if this is the case, that one must question whether the classed positions combined with the terms and conditions of employment under this particular program limits the possibility for collective action, or from benefiting from the cultural capital, say for instance, from professional networks like Diaspora, or from other activist groups. If yes or no, then what are the options for resistance, and what are the implications for those workers? Another concern that Jessie Ann shared was the racial undertones that underpin the program. This is also evident in the literature. But again, there's a lack of advocacy and there's a lack of intervention that specifically address the racial underpinnings of the program. Through this discussion, what we see are concerns for race relations, anti-Black sentiments, and other acts of microaggression, racial profiling, and segregation in public spaces. How do we address this? Work of Hal Malson in 2016 shed light on the mechanisms of power that underpin the program. He refers to the issue of panoptic or psychological effects of those workers, where they are constrained and regulated, and where the panoptic power expressed through their legal status prevents them from being part of collective resistance. In this understanding, it is likened to modern-day slavery, much like the analogy that Jesse Ann used, where there's limited movement, hyper-exploitative and abusive relationships that are sustained by the power and authority of the employers. It is sustained through curfews and limited interactions while on the farm. But I cannot help but mention the gendered considerations that we must give in understanding the situation of these agricultural farm workers. And there are particular concerns for women. And Jessie Ann also shared the experience where she also suffered from fibroids. And she hid from her employer that she had, one, the fibroids, that two, she left the farm unknown to him to get it removed, and three, that she suffered for almost 6 weeks, but worked on the farm every day while recovering from fibroid surgery. In closing, I wish to reiterate that while the case of Jessie Ann Miller provides a single narrative that touched on the complex nexus of socioeconomic status, intra-household dynamics, and social mobility for single mothers and children, the issue remained consistent with the work of other researchers who have examined the stories of Caribbean nationals and also Mexican workers. My concern, however, as outlined earlier, is that even with the emerging body of work, that the stories remain relatively invisible, with a less than substantive attempt at a policy level to regulate such a program while sustaining and emboldening those persons who participate in them. My call, therefore, is for greater interrogation of this particular program and other such formalized structured programs that promote labor mobility such as this. My hope is also for such considerations to be grounded in more systematic and systemic analyses that treat with the contentious issues of difference, respect, and social justice. I see this as an excellent platform and opportunity within the framing of the Canada-Caribbean Partnership.